That is certainly protocol-wise not what you do. But again, coming back to what are some of the security implications of doing that, I think it actually is costly in the long run. I don't think Keir Starmer is going to start, sharing his views on what's happening with allies or adversaries, knowing full well that it could be splashed across the front page of the Times in the next morning's paper.
Well, let's talk now to Bruen, who's former Director of Global Engagement at the White House under President Obama. Mr. Bruen, very good afternoon from us. We do find ourselves hanging off Donald Trump's every word, no matter what we're going to feel about those words when they're uttered. And this is exactly where he wants us, isn't it?
It is. And look, it also comes down to the definition of those words, as he brought up on Air Force One flying here to The Hague. His notion that Article 5, that sacrosanct part of the NATO alliance, might be up for definition or even doubt, I think still looms large here. While certainly there's a lot of relief in the room that, he has not, figuratively blown up the place, at the same time, I think there remains a whole lot of questions as to whether or not the United States would come to the aid of one of our NATO partners if they should find themselves attacked.
Can we talk a bit about the language that is being used here? If we focus on the words of Mark Rutte and this extraordinarily ingratiating series of texts that he sent to President Trump, what do you hear people saying about that there? And also, do you have any thoughts as to what, if Mark Rutte hadn't felt the need to be so ingratiating, he actually would have said?
Look, I think this is just smart diplomacy. You have got to find a way to avoid the largest, the most important member of the alliance, quite frankly, creating chaos. And so if it requires some flattery, if it requires generating some warm feelings on a personal level between Mark Rutte and Donald Trump, I think that is a price worth paying for the security, the stability here in Europe. It may, ruffle some feathers. It may put people off. But at the end of the day, I think there is a far more important issue at stake here. And, Rutte should feel rightly pleased with himself and with NATO for having gotten through a summit, which is not a small task these days, without having Trump storming off.
Yes, yeah. If you do suck up this much to a world leader, does it not make it incredibly difficult to then become a wise voice of criticism later?
Look, I think it also opens up channels. Clearly, Rutte and Trump have a text change going on. Perhaps, he'll be added to one of those signal chains that are circulating around the National Security Council, revealing some of our upcoming missions. But at the end of the day, as a recovering diplomat, you want to be able to have those one-to-one top-level communications. However, this is what I think is concerning. The fact that Trump is willing then to publicize those private conversations is going to force world leaders to be much more circumspect in what they're going to tell him directly. And that could, quite frankly, cause some problems, because you just don't know, is Trump going to blast your unvarnished comments all over the world?
Yeah. Well, tell us a bit more about those problems that you foresee from that.
Well, one, look, Trump has long relayed information that is either sensitive or even secret. But, in this latest case, this was clearly an attempt by the Secretary General to get the ball rolling in a positive direction as Trump was flying over the Atlantic. And Trump thought, look, this is a perfect opportunity for me to puff myself up, my self-importance, all of the things that I've been saying to the American people. Here it is, the Secretary General of NATO saying that. So he wanted to get it out there. Now, from a diplomatic standpoint, that's poor form. That is certainly protocol-wise not what you do. But again, coming back to what are some of the security implications of doing that, I think it actually is costly in the long run. I don't think Keir Starmer is going to start, sharing his views on what's happening with allies or adversaries, knowing full well that it could be splashed across the front page of the Times in the next morning's paper.
Yeah, we are speaking to you at the same conference that Donald Trump is at the moment. You must have done this kind of transatlantic diplomacy so many times in your job as former director of global engagement at the White House. How much of a conversation is being had about how all of this plays for President Trump back in America?
Well, he had a tough week when it comes to his foreign policy. Obviously, his coalition with the MAGA movement saw unprecedented strains as he not only talked about regime change, but even the very notion of a foreign foray at a time when he has been trying to disentangle the United States from some of this international intervention, just seemed inconsistent. It seemed, quite frankly, to go against what he had promised during the campaign. And he's tried to pull that back slightly. He's tried to reconcile it and say, again, this is all about peace through strength. But I do think that, he had a wake-up call this week. And look, he rightly should be taking credit. I can say this even as somebody who worked for Barack Obama. He should be taking credit for having pushed NATO members to not only 2%, but now to this new 5% threshold. That is a major accomplishment. It's one that he deserves that credit for. I mean, I remember when we were just trying to get the NATO members to commit to 2%, it wasn't easy. Now, his tactics are unorthodox. They're unsavory in a number of ways, but he did it.
Yeah. What about the reaction that this new normal of his language might actually create? I mean, you can completely understand how, for people who really like the way that Donald Trump conducts himself, the fact that he's sworn, whilst talking to reporters, he continually uses the word scum, that won't matter to them at all. That will make them like him and respect him even more. But do you get the sense now, because of the victories that he is managing to achieve diplomatically, that actually people who object to it just have to get over that?
I think so. And look, it's not just Trump. We're seeing as social media conversations evolve that the way that you're talking both about politics and international affairs has got to change. You're in a much more competitive space. You're seeing things that are not just being shortened and used in slang. I'm trying to keep up with my 12-year-old son and some of the words that he's bringing home from school. But that's just a natural evolution. And now you've got Trump, who has long been a savvy communicator, somebody who understands how do I make a headline. And I think he is going farther, partially because he feels more comfortable in this term than he perhaps did in his first term. And so, yes, we are going to have to get used to it. But the other part of it is, I think leaders, especially here in Europe, are themselves going to need to translate their points into Trumpese. I made this point back in November after Trump was elected and did some talks here in Europe. And I said, it's fine and well that we are, working on some of the diplomatic language. Now we got to find a way to communicate that in Trump's Washington.
So do you expect pretty soon that we'll have a potty-mouthed Ursula von der Leyen?
That would be certainly a sight to see. But look, I think at the end of the day, it also is going to come down to who are the folks, the likes of the Italian prime minister, the likes of other younger, perhaps a little bit hipper leaders who are able to convey that kind of message in a way that is going to resonate both with Donald Trump, but quite frankly, with younger audiences and vaster audiences here in Europe.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. I know you're a busy man this afternoon. Brett Bruen is former Director of Global Engagement at the White House under President Obama.